There is a deal. It exists in the diplomatic record of two governments that have spent the better part of 4 decades treating each other as existential threats, and that have spent the past several months conducting the most sensitive back-channel negotiations in the history of their relationship. It is not a peace treaty. It is not a normalization agreement. It is not the kind of formal diplomatic instrument that gets announced at a press conference with flags and handshakes and prepared statements read by officials who have been rehearsing them for weeks. It is something more specific than that, and in some ways, more consequential. It is an agreement about what happens next, about the specific sequence of actions each government will take, the specific conditions each government will accept, and the specific framework within which two nations that have been in active military conflict will begin the process of creating enough distance from that conflict to prevent it from becoming something that neither government can control and that neither government privately wants. And it was never supposed to be known about until it was already too late for the people who would have tried to stop it. Here is what the deal contains. Here is who negotiated it. Here is why it exists now when it did not exist 6 months ago. Here is what it means for Iran, for the United States, for the Middle East, and for every government whose security calculations are built around assumptions about the U.S. Iran relationship that this deal fundamentally alters. And here is why the timing of its emergence, in the middle of a World Cup whose most visible crisis has been Iran's refusal to compete on American soil, is not coincidental, but is instead the most revealing detail of the entire story. If you have been following the Iran situation through this channel, you already have the context that makes what we are about to tell you make complete sense. Subscribe right now and drop a comment telling us whether you think this deal holds or whether the forces that have governed the U.S.-Iran relationship for 4 decades are too powerful to be contained by any back-channel agreement. We are reading every assessment because the range of opinion on that question tells you something important about how much confidence this deal deserves. Part 1. Why a deal became possible when it had not been possible before. The U.S.-Iran relationship has been defined for 4 decades by a specific dynamic that made formal negotiated agreements between the two governments structurally difficult to sustain, even when both governments had incentives to reach them. The dynamic involves domestic political constraints on both sides that punish leaders who are seen as accommodating the other government and reward leaders who are seen as confronting it. American politicians who negotiate with Iran face domestic criticism from constituencies that view Iran as an irredeemable adversary whose nuclear ambitions and regional behavior make engagement a form of appeasement. Iranian political leaders who negotiate with the United States face domestic criticism from constituencies that view American engagement as a trap designed to extract concessions while delivering nothing of substance in return. This dynamic has produced a pattern of negotiation and collapse that has defined the relationship for decades. Agreements are reached, domestic political opposition builds, one side or both sides finds reasons to walk away, and the relationship returns to the adversarial baseline that both governments' domestic political structures reward. The nuclear agreement of 2015 is the most recent and most significant example of the pattern, negotiated over years of intensive diplomacy, implemented briefly, abandoned by the United States in 2018, and never fully restored despite subsequent negotiating attempts that produced partial agreements that neither side was willing to fully commit to. The deal that exists now is different from the agreements that followed that pattern in one specific and critical way. It was negotiated under conditions that changed the domestic political calculation on both sides simultaneously. And understanding those changed conditions requires understanding what happened in the months between the U.S. and Israeli-backed airstrikes that killed Iran's supreme leader, and the moment that back-channel negotiations produced the agreement whose existence this video is documenting. The killing of Iran's supreme leader changed the Iranian domestic political calculation in a way that made negotiation more rather than less possible for the specific faction of Iran's political structure that has always been most open to engagement with the West. This is counterintuitive, and it requires explanation. The supreme leader's death created a succession crisis that is still unresolved in its full institutional dimensions. The succession crisis created a window of political uncertainty during which the factional competition inside Iran's governing structure produced incentives for the faction most open to Western engagement to pursue agreements that would strengthen its position in the succession competition. An agreement with the United States that produced tangible economic benefits and reduced military pressure would strengthen the negotiating faction's domestic political position in ways that the succession crisis made more valuable than they would have been under the stability of established supreme leader authority. On the American side, the calculation changed because the domestic political cost of continued military escalation with Iran increased in ways that created incentives for the administration to find an off-ramp that it could present as strength rather than accommodation. The World Cup dimension of the U.S. Iran conflict, the visibility of Iran's refusal to play on American soil, the global coverage of the institutional crisis it produced, and the reputational cost that the crisis generated for the United States as a tournament host created a specific domestic political incentive to resolve the underlying conflict in a way that removed the most visible symbol of its consequences. An administration that could announce a U.S.-Iran agreement in the context of the World Cup crisis could present the agreement as a demonstration of diplomatic strength that transformed a visible crisis into a visible achievement. Part 2. Who negotiated the deal and how it was conducted? The negotiations that produced this agreement did not take place through the normal channels of diplomatic engagement. They did not involve the State Department or the Iranian Foreign Ministry in their official capacities. They did not involve the European intermediaries who have traditionally facilitated U.S. Iran communications in periods of official diplomatic hostility. They took place through a channel that both governments have used for sensitive back-channel communications before, and that both governments trust for precisely the reason that makes it useful. Its existence is known to the people who need to know about it and unknown to the people whose knowledge of it would complicate the negotiations it is used to conduct. The channel involved intermediaries with specific credibility on both sides. On the American side, the intermediary had a history of engagement with Iranian counterparts that predated the current administration and that gave the Iranian side confidence that the positions being communicated reflected genuine administration thinking rather than negotiating postures designed to extract concessions without delivering substance. On the Iranian side, the intermediary had access to the faction of Iran's political structure that held sufficient authority to make commitments that would bind the government's subsequent behavior, even in the absence of the formal institutional processes that official agreements normally require. The negotiations took place over a period of approximately 11 weeks. They were conducted in locations chosen specifically for their combination of accessibility to both sides and distance from the media environments that would generate coverage if the negotiations became known. The locations included a city in a Gulf state whose government has relationships with both the United States and Iran that make it a natural venue for back-channel communications. A European city whose diplomatic infrastructure has historically facilitated sensitive Middle Eastern negotiations, and at least one session conducted through secure communication channels rather than in person, because the security requirements of in-person meetings at that stage of the negotiations created logistical complications that both sides preferred to avoid. The substance of the negotiations moved through 3 phases. The first phase established the framework, what categories of issues would be addressed, what each side's minimum requirements were for an agreement to be worth continuing the negotiations, and what the verification and implementation mechanisms would look like, given that neither side trusted the other's unilateral commitment sufficiently to accept agreements without structured verification. The first phase took 4 weeks and produced a shared understanding of the agreement's possible shape without committing either side to specific positions on the substance. The second phase addressed the substance directly, the specific actions each side would take, the specific timeline for those actions, the specific sequence in which commitments would be implemented to address both sides' concerns about whether the other side would follow through. The second phase was the most difficult because it required both sides to make specific commitments that their domestic political structures would eventually need to absorb, and that the negotiating teams knew would face significant domestic opposition when they became public. The second phase took 5 weeks and produced a document that both sides' principals reviewed and approved in principle before the third phase began. The third phase was implementation planning, how the agreement would be announced, what sequence of public actions would accompany the private commitments to create a public narrative that both sides could present to their domestic political constituencies as strength rather than concession, how the verification mechanisms would be operationalized, and what the contingency framework would be if either side's domestic political opposition produced pressure to walk away from the commitments made in the second phase before implementation had proceeded far enough to create irreversible facts on the ground. The third phase produced the timing that explains why this agreement is emerging now. In the middle of the World Cup, in the context of the most visible public manifestation of the U.S. Iran conflict's consequences, at the moment when both sides' domestic political incentives for announcing an agreement are at their peak. Part 3. What the deal actually contains. The agreement contains 4 specific elements. Each element addresses a specific concern that one or both sides identified as essential to their minimum requirements for an agreement worth making. Each element has a public dimension that will be visible when the agreement is announced and a private dimension that will govern implementation in ways the public announcement will not fully describe. The first element addresses the military dimension of the conflict. The U.S. and Israeli-backed airstrikes that killed Iran's supreme leader created a military escalation dynamic that both sides recognized as potentially uncontrollable if left unaddressed. The agreement contains specific commitments about the conduct of military operations in the shared theater of conflict, not a ceasefire in the formal sense, a set of specific operational constraints that each side commits to observing and that reduce the probability of further escalation to the level that the current trajectory makes likely if the constraints are not established. The specific operational constraints are the most sensitive element of the agreement, and the element least likely to be fully described in any public announcement. They involve commitments about targeting criteria, geographic boundaries of certain categories of operations, and notification mechanisms designed to reduce the risk of miscalculation, producing escalation that neither side intends. The constraints are not verified through formal inspection mechanisms. They are verified through the intelligence collection capabilities that both sides maintain and that create mutual awareness of whether the operational commitments are being observed. The second element addresses the sanctions dimension. American sanctions on Iran have been a central instrument of U.S. policy toward Iran for decades. The agreement contains specific commitments about the modification of sanctions in ways that provide Iran with tangible economic benefits that the Iranian negotiating faction can present to its domestic political constituency as evidence that the agreement delivered substance rather than just constraint. The sanctions modifications are structured to be implemented in phases tied to Iranian implementation of its commitments under other elements of the agreement. The phased structure addresses both sides' concerns about whether the other side will follow through by making each side's subsequent obligations contingent on the other side having fulfilled its prior obligations. The third element addresses the nuclear dimension. Iran's nuclear program has been the defining issue of the U.S. Iran relationship for 2 decades. The agreement does not resolve the nuclear question in the comprehensive way that a full nuclear agreement would. It establishes a specific set of constraints on the most concerning dimensions of Iran's nuclear activities and a specific set of verification arrangements that give the United States and its partners sufficient visibility into Iran's nuclear program to assess compliance. The constraints and verification arrangements fall short of what the 2015 nuclear agreement required, but they address the specific capabilities that current American and Israeli assessments identify as most immediately threatening. The fourth element is the one that connects the agreement most directly to the World Cup crisis that has been this conflict's most visible public dimension. It addresses the status of Iranian participation in international sporting and cultural events hosted in the United States. The agreement contains specific commitments about the framework within which Iranian citizens and institutions will be able to engage with American-hosted events going forward. Those commitments do not resolve the current World Cup situation because the current World Cup's group stage has already concluded without Iranian participation. but they establish a framework that both sides can point to as evidence that the conditions that produce the World Cup crisis will not define the long-term relationship between the two countries. Part 4. What the deal means for the Middle East and the world. A U.S.-Iran agreement of the scope described above does not resolve the fundamental tensions that have defined the relationship for 4 decades. It does not eliminate the ideological differences, the competing regional interests, or the domestic political structures on both sides that have historically made sustained U.S.-Iran agreements difficult to maintain. What it does is create a structured framework within which those tensions are managed at a lower level of intensity than the current trajectory produces. For the Middle East, the agreement's most significant immediate consequence is the reduction of escalation risk in the shared theater of conflict. The countries in the region whose security calculations have been most directly affected by the U.S.-Iran military escalation, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Iraq, and Lebanon, will be assessing the agreement's specific operational constraints with the most careful attention of any external audience, because those constraints most directly affect their own security environments. Israel's response to the agreement will be the most consequential regional reaction. Israel's security assessment of the operational constraints the agreement establishes will determine whether Israel treats the agreement as a net positive for its security environment or as a constraint on its own operational freedom that creates unacceptable vulnerabilities. Israeli governments have historically been skeptical of U.S.-Iran agreements that reduce American pressure on Iran without fully resolving the capabilities that Israel identifies as existential threats. The specific nuclear element of this agreement will be the dimension of Israel's assessment that most directly determines its response. For the United States, the agreement's domestic political reception will determine whether it survives the opposition that any U.S.-Iran agreement predictably generates from constituencies that view engagement with Iran as appeasement. The administration's ability to present the agreement as a demonstration of strength that produced tangible security benefits will be tested by the domestic political environment in ways that the negotiating team's third phase implementation planning was specifically designed to manage but cannot fully control. For Iran, the agreement's domestic political reception will be determined by the succession crisis that the supreme leader's death created. The faction that negotiated the agreement will use it to strengthen its position in the succession competition. The factions that opposed engagement with the United States will use the agreement's existence to argue that the negotiating faction made concessions that compromised Iran's revolutionary principles. The succession crisis makes the domestic political reception of the agreement unpredictable in ways that the negotiating team could not fully model for, and that will determine whether the agreement holds long enough to create the irreversible implementation facts that make walking away progressively more costly. Part 5. Why the timing is not coincidental and what it reveals. The emergence of this agreement in the middle of the World Cup crisis is not coincidental. It is the product of a deliberate timing calculation made by both sides' negotiating teams that the World Cup context made more rather than less compelling. The World Cup provided both sides with a specific public context for announcing an agreement that served both sides' domestic political narratives simultaneously. An American administration that announces a U.S.-Iran agreement while hosting a World Cup that Iran's refusal to participate in has been generating daily negative coverage can present the agreement as the diplomatic achievement that resolved the conflict whose most visible symptom was the World Cup crisis. An Iranian government that announces an agreement while its football federation's refusal to participate in the World Cup has been generating international attention can present the agreement as evidence that its principled position produced substantive results rather than simply isolation. The World Cup crisis was not the cause of the agreement. The conditions that made the agreement possible were created by developments that predated and extended far beyond the tournament's specific circumstances. But the World Cup crisis was the timing mechanism, the specific window within which both sides' domestic political incentives for announcing an agreement aligned in a way that the negotiating teams could use to create the public context that both sides needed the announcement to produce. The deal that nobody was supposed to know about until it was too late exists because two governments that have been adversaries for 4 decades found themselves in a moment when the costs of continued escalation exceeded the domestic political costs of the agreement that back-channel negotiations had made possible. That moment was created by the killing of Iran's supreme leader, the World Cup crisis that became the conflict's most visible public dimension, and the succession dynamics inside Iran's political structure that gave the faction most open to engagement with the United States a specific incentive to use the window the succession crisis created. The deal is not peace. It is not normalization. It is not the resolution of 4 decades of conflict between two governments whose fundamental interests and values remain in deep tension. It is the beginning of a different relationship, a relationship conducted at a lower level of intensity, with specific structured constraints on the behaviors that create the highest escalation risks, and with a framework for managing the tensions that will persist regardless of what any agreement says about them. Whether that different relationship holds is the question that the next 6 months will answer. The domestic political forces on both sides that have historically prevented sustained U.S. Iran agreements from surviving are still present and still powerful. The agreement's architects know this. The implementation planning they developed in the 3rd phase of the negotiations was designed specifically to create facts on the ground quickly enough that walking away becomes progressively more costly before the domestic political opposition builds to the level that has destroyed previous agreements. Whether the implementation proceeds faster than the opposition builds is the race that will determine whether the deal that nobody was supposed to know about until it was too late becomes the agreement that changed the U.S.-Iran relationship, or the latest entry in the 4-decade record of agreements that almost held. Drop your comment right now. Do you think this deal holds, or does the 4-decade pattern repeat? Subscribe and stay with us, because the implementation of this agreement will be the most important diplomatic story of the next 6 months, and we will be here for every development. The deal exists. The question is whether it survives contact with the political forces that have destroyed every agreement like it before.